A male bluebird of paradise is advertising for a mate. It's quite a performance, but he's not the only bird of paradise here keen to make an impression. There are nearly 40 different kinds on the island of New Guinea, each with a display seemingly more bizarre than the rest. A rifle bird of paradise. Like many jungle animals, birds of paradise avoid competing with each other, and these do so by living in different parts of this jungle-covered island. The six-plumed bird of paradise displays in his special clearing on the forest floor. The magnificent bird of paradise favours the low branches of bushes. His female is modestly dressed. The male has a good set of lungs, but he'll have to do more than flutter his eyelids if he wants to impress her. It'll all depend on his performance. The females may be dull-looking, but they're very picky. And it's time for a really close inspection. His right side looks fine, but what about his left? Pretty impressive, but is he magnificent enough? Oh dear, her departure says it all. Generations of choosy females have driven the evolution of these remarkable displays. The more extravagant a male is, the more likely he'll be noticed.
Tell me if you guys have any trouble hearing me. Just wave in the back if you ever have trouble hearing me. And when you guys ask questions, if you could try to speak up. That was a request that was made as well, just to try to speak loudly with questions. Questions are welcome. Interrupt any time. I tend to just buzz through these slides, right? So interrupt me if you want to ask something. Feel free. Carrying on today with some material I didn't get to last time. I'm not quite caught up, but hopefully after the next couple of lectures I'll get caught up. Finishing with a discussion of sexual selection. You just saw that video of sexual selection in some birds of paradise, and some cool examples of coevolution as a way to introduce species concepts and the question of questions, speciation and the origin of new species, the one major question that Darwin and others were wrestling with. And the mechanisms of speciation we'll look at today. At the end, we won't get to all of them, but we'll start to discuss the differences in allopatric and sympatric speciation, major mechanisms of speciation that are thought to drive the process in plants and animals. Sexual selection leads to some bizarre forms in organisms. And this was a topic of discussion around Darwin's time because in the origin, he didn't address this in detail. He would later write a whole book on sexual selection. It seemed to provide a contradiction to natural selection. When you see organisms in nature, for example, peacocks with the ridiculous spray of feathers and all these shimmering eyes that exist on these feathers that they use to attract peahens. But at the same time that these things are good at attracting peahens, they're also good at attracting predators, right? And they slow the bird down. It's a big, heavy apparatus that's highly visible and slows the bird down. So wouldn't it attract predators and thereby lead to increased mortality and reduced reproductive output? Darwin couched this discussion in the context of sexual selection and the increased reproductive output that this male might experience as a result of being attractive to females. So any negative from exposure to predators would be counterbalanced and exceeded by the positives associated in their fitness in relation to females. And that's the general contours of the way that debate was framed early on about the role of sexual selection in these processes. Sexual selection can be considered a category under natural selection if you want. It's sort of just a semantic issue, really, whether you think of sexual selection as a distinct type of selection or something under natural selection. In my opinion, it doesn't matter too much about how you categorize it. But the importance of it is quite real because you see this all over the natural world. Now, sexual selection can occur between the sexes, as I was describing with the attraction of the female peahen. It's an attraction of the female to the male between the sexes, intersexual selection. But you also have situations of intrasexual selection where the sexes compete for access to mates. And there are great examples of that among males in, for example, our friendly elephant seals, the local elephant seals that I described. Yeah. If you roar loudly. These bull elephants, you can see them right now on the coast, just within an hour's drive. The males are huge. In comparison to the females, they're really big. And the males enter these great battles. These are southern elephant seals, the sister species to our local elephant seals. The same idea. I've got a video that I can find of any local. And you'll see the types of battles they engage in. And these things last, these battles, sometimes for hours. So that's a really big male on the left and a somewhat smaller male on the right. But that's not friendly competition there. The young animals will engage in the sparring matches and practicing for these later, more serious bouts, but they're really digging in. They have teeth that they'll try to slash their opponent with. They develop a shield on their chests, a thickened layer of skin that functions as a shield against these attacks. It's exhausting, but they get bloody. These shields get bloody. They get exhausted. The male on the right is trying to defend this beach because that's a beach that it occupies and defends to protect its harem. Because there are a bunch of females on the beach that are defended by this male. The beach itself is a breeding ground, and females need access to breeding grounds. The numbers of suitable breeding grounds, the number of good beaches that are relatively well protected for these seals are limited. So space is limited, and the females need access to these spatial resources. So males defend these spaces against other males. So one big bull male can be the occupant of a beach and defend it against all incoming males. And the big males will hang offshore and wait sometimes weeks, sometimes even across the years, for opportunities to come in and try to bully the other male off the beach to gain access to that whole harem. And it leads to major differences in the sexes in fitness and reproductive success. So when you look at data like these, you can see here the number of offspring that the individuals have on the x-axis. It says number of offspring weaned. Weaned just means successfully raised, post feeding with milk, that the offspring goes off and is successful. So number of offspring weaned or number of offspring produced here, and the percentage of the males and the percentage of the females that produce that many offspring, as shown on the x-axis here. Let me try to get a better modality for... Okay, so 0 to 10 offspring for the females. What percentage of females produce no successful offspring during their lifetime? Well, it's upwards 60 or more percent don't succeed in producing any successful offspring, just because it's a dangerous world offshore with the sharks and the killer whales and all the possible sources of mortality for the young. So there aren't many young produced for any female. Most of the successful females are producing 1, 2, or 3 offspring. A relatively high percentage, when you add up those numbers, are producing a few offspring. And a smaller number of females are producing up to 10 offspring during the course of their lives. But look at the males by contrast. A different scale here on the x-axis, running all the way up to 100 offspring, as opposed to 10 for the females. Most of the males are not producing any. Even a higher percentage of the males than the females are producing no offspring at all, no successful offspring. But a small number of males are producing a whole lot of individual offspring, with some males producing up to over 80 offspring. So the majority of the reproductive output is held by a very few number of individual males, where it's more balanced in the females. So very different worlds in which the two sexes are living here, very different sources of competitive interactions that influence both. And it has effects on their morphology. The big bull elephant is as long as from here to the wall. They are gigantic. And you can go walk among them at Año Nuevo on the beach there if you set up an appointment with a docent. Call the national park there and set up an appointment. I don't know if they're still available this season, but they'll walk you right among them. And it's very exciting because you go around one of these dunes and there might be a big bull there that decides to charge. Now, they're not very fast, so you can scurry away, but there's always that source of excitement when you're hiking out there that you might get charged by a big bull elephant. They don't use their hind legs, so they kind of inchworm, but they're gigantic, and it's exciting. And that influences their morphology. Not only are they huge, but they have the big nose, they have the chest shield. They differ in the way they look from the females. And traits that... That's in the case of intrasexual selection. You get those differences in traits, or the massive horns of certain ungulates, like we saw a couple of rams up there earlier on a slide. Those are similarly derived traits in the males for doing battle. If you look at intersexual selection and the types of traits that might develop to attract females, you'd refer to those as epigamic traits. Traits that are selected by the opposite sex for some aspect of reproduction. And the lizards, like these anoles, are familiar if you've gone to tropical habitats, because they'll be perched on a small branch and they'll throw out their dewlap, this structure that's often colorful, and they'll do push-ups and they'll make themselves look really showy in an attempt to attract females. And meanwhile, they're attracting birds of prey and other organisms that might predate upon them, but counterbalanced, again, by the success they're having in attracting females and their reproductive output. Birds going to great lengths, as you saw in the video before lecture, of the birds and their crazy dances that they'll go through to attract females. Or bower birds like this, building these very elaborate nests. This one has collected, I think, a bunch of plastic objects that it finds attractive, or it hopes will be attractive to a female. So it's decorated its bower for these females in the hopes of attracting them. The female's supposed to walk through and investigate this whole apparatus and decide whether it wants to stay and mate with that male. Here's another bower. All these shells are deemed attractive, and it's decorated it with all these empty shells. That's very costly. It's spending a lot of its days building these things and exposing itself to trouble in the process of elaborately building these nests. Why are the males doing that and not so much the females? Why is it the females that are the ones investigating, nitpicking, and being choosy about which males to mate with in these systems and other systems like this? Why is it females that are usually choosing? In what sense? She said maybe it's strength.
Well, for some animals, it's physical strength.
Okay.
Who can provide the offspring that may have the best chance of survival?
So somehow related to the physical strength of the organisms. The males are often larger and often stronger in these systems. And so the females are looking for the ones that appear to be strongest and might give their offspring the greatest chance of survival. Good. We'll look at some evidence behind something like that in a second. Yeah, that comes into play. One back here. Go ahead. From a biological perspective, females invest more time and energy in their offspring, and thus there's selection pressure that exists for them to be choosy because they can't afford to make a mistake. Any elaborations on that point or other points? Females produce what? Fewer gametes. Fewer gametes, but larger and more expensive gametes. And that's what's illustrated here and known as the phenomenon of anisogamy. Eggs are just bigger and more energetically rich and expensive than sperm. And that goes back, that has deep roots. So eggs are more costly to produce, and then, as you indicated, it doesn't just stop there, because in the case of the birds, for example, it's the female that develops the embryo in her own body. And that's expensive. Just the production of the egg, the unfertilized egg, is expensive relative to sperm. And then the growing of that egg, once fertilized into the young animal, is extremely expensive and heavy. And then the baby is born in the case of the bird or the mammal, and usually it's the female that's responsible for feeding it, whether it's from milk or from catching insects. Sometimes the male's not involved at all. So costly again for the female at that stage. So the costs all along tend to be greater for the females in these systems. And thus, the female needs to be careful about the investment that she makes in terms of the male contribution. That's the logic. And the female should choose a male that's going to be providing a genetic contribution that's successful in the local environment, according to the Darwinian terms. So an example of that, so those are frogs calling. Frogs are calling right now. I heard them last night in Berkeley. It's warming up. It's still damp out, so the little local chorus frogs are starting to call in the park. This is another type of related frog to the one we have locally, and they call like that. You know, you've all seen it, at least in a video like this. The males are doing that. The females are not calling. It's the males calling. And some males call more loudly than other males, or for longer periods of time. According to a good genes hypothesis, the strength of the production relates to the fitness of those genes for the local environment by the one who's making those productions. And this is along the lines of what you were saying about the strength of the male, I think. The good genes hypothesis, which I just explained in a poor way, I think. The good genes hypothesis suggests that males are honest in the display they're making, reflecting the fitness of their genes for the local environment. So a male that calls for a long time and loudly would indicate strength for the lineage, and the female should be selecting them if they're not being deceitful. So a test of the good genes hypothesis in frogs was made in an elegant way in this study, where long-calling frogs and short-calling frogs had their sperm extracted and taken and used to fertilize the eggs of a single female frog. So the eggs of this female were split, and half of them were allowed to fertilize with a long-calling male, and half of them were allowed to fertilize with a short-calling male, and the offspring were followed. The offspring of the short-calling father and the offspring of the long-calling father were followed through time, and the fitness of their offspring was tracked over time. Here's a table that shows some data. Now the data are too few, and more data are needed, but it was suggestive by watching the growth of the larvae that developed from the fertilized eggs and the survival of those larvae and how long it took for those larvae to develop to the adult frogs. There were clear indications that in a couple of those categories that the long-calling frogs' offspring were more successful in these terms. So this provided support for a good genes hypothesis in a nice controlled study. More studies like that are needed to test hypotheses like these. It's difficult to get, certainly in birds or mammals. Easier in amphibia like this where you have more control. A brief foray into coevolution here. Coevolution, I don't think I've defined it on a slide, but we can think of coevolution as changes in adaptations of organisms in relation to another organism. So co-evolving organisms, co-evolving species adapt to one another through time in measurable ways. Darwin knew of this flower that grew in Madagascar, and its floral structures suggested the existence of a pollinator with an extremely long proboscis that would be able to access the nectar and serve to pollinate the flower. So upon seeing this flower, Darwin predicted the existence of an organism, which wasn't known at the time. And it wasn't until after his death that this moth was discovered that had the very long proboscis that was observed to pollinate this flower. He was making an inference based on coevolution, based on the morphology of the flower for a co-evolved pollinator. And it highlighted for people the power of the argument in predicting something that wasn't known to exist, and then it exists. That's astonishing to people who have no exposure to the predictive potential of biology. It set in motion many of these studies of coevolution. And we have a great one right here in the Berkeley Hills, another drama playing out right here now. And if you haven't seen these creatures, try to schedule a hike in the next couple of weeks because they're out in numbers now, these newts. I can give you some suggestions about where to go, especially if you have a car. You can go see them by the thousands. But you can also see them up in the Botanic Garden. The UC Botanic Garden has newts in its ponds usually, although numbers are declining in recent years. According to the director there, they're still up there though. It's an amazing creature. This is one of the species. We have two species locally. This is Pterica granulosa. There's another species. Pterica is the genus. They are called newts. They are amphibians related to frogs, right? This is one in an Unken reflex, U-N-K-E-N, Unken reflex. It's displaying its colorful belly and curling its tail to display the orange under its tail in contrast with the dark upper portions of the body to make itself visible. It's not trying to hide here. It's trying to make itself visible. It's aposematic. I'll just spell that on the board here. A-P-O-S-E-M-A-T-I-C. Aposematic. It's a warning to would-be predators that they would be making a mistake should they try to attack or eat this creature. And the ones that do eat them are these garter snakes. The local garter snake preys upon them, These things are extremely toxic, the local newts. Now, you can go have fun and look for them and even hold them and not worry about any harm, but don't put them in your mouth. Don't play the silly game and lick them because you've heard that they're dangerous and you want to test the notion. They are dangerous, trust us. They will kill you. The toxin in one of these animals could kill a bunch of us. But just by holding them, you don't have any problems. It has to get into your mouth, and you won't do that. Tetrodotoxin is the toxin that they are using for defense. It's the same toxin that pufferfish and some octopuses have in their systems to defend themselves. It's a neural toxin and is very effective. But the garter snakes have developed immunity to a degree to that toxin. Over the millennia, who knows how long, we don't have good estimates of that, the garter snakes have developed immunity and the newts have become more toxic. In response, the garter snakes have developed greater immunity and the newts have become more toxic. And that's this arms race, this coevolutionary arms race, that has led to a hyper-toxic newt that's way more toxic than it needs to be for most predators. An owl eats one and it will die. There was a graduate student in this department who found an owl once dead, dissected it, and found a newt in its belly, and made the connection that it ate a newt and it died. So this is an example of coevolution in this local case. It's a world-famous case, and it plays out in the Berkeley Hills. It plays out in the East Bay, and a bit more broadly down towards Santa Cruz County, but it's really a local phenomenon, this arms race. It gets better when you look at this third member of the system, a local salamander, that looks a lot like the newt. The first time you go out, if you saw this thing, you'd think it's a newt. People call them newts all the time. They're not newts. They're also amphibians, but they're not closely related to newts. They have these grooves down their side. You'll start to see that if you look at them. They have a sort of a constriction at the base of the tail. They kind of walk taller than a newt. Well, this is a salamander called Ensatina. It's convergent on the newt. Why? Why does this thing look like a newt? Yes, exactly. It quote-unquote, she used air quotes there to say it knows that the newt is poisonous, which is an appropriate use of air quotes, because it doesn't necessarily consciously know that the newt is poisonous, but it has evolved to look like the newt to benefit from the warning coloration that the newt has to illustrate its toxicity. Well, the Ensatina salamander is also flashing that coloration. You can see the comparison. Dark above, orange below in the newt. The newt, you can't see its eye here, but it even has a little yellow strip on the top of its eye. And the salamander also has that right down to the details of the eyeball. It has the yellow on top of the eye. This local Ensatina does. Dark above, orange below. It's very similar. So it's mimicking the newt, right? You don't want to eat salamanders either. They're just most salamanders are have a small amount of toxicity. Don't eat those either. But they're nothing like the newt. In the context of mimicry, you have these two types, which it wouldn't be Bio 1b if you weren't introduced to Batesian and Mullerian mimicry. So these are based on these two guys who were studying in the Amazon in the 1800s and had discovered this phenomenon where organisms will mimic another organism to benefit themselves. Bates was the first to work on this, and he was looking in the context of butterflies that themselves were not distasteful, but they were mimicking butterflies that were distasteful. And it became known as Batesian mimicry, or Batesian mimicry. Mueller from Germany was also there, but he found some butterflies that were mimicking, that were distasteful or harmful, mimicking other ones that were distasteful or harmful. So you have an honest case of mimicry and a dishonest case of mimicry, if you want. And what is the local salamander doing in relation to the newt? Most people consider it a type of Batesian mimicry because the salamander is in fact harmless, although as I described, it's vaguely poisonous. So some people, it's a sort of a minor debate as to whether you would call the local salamander a Batesian mimic or a Mullerian mimic. Common phenomenon in nature. And this is all in the context of natural selection, right? Selection is the hypothesis for the driving of all of these adaptive changes in the natural world. The only force among the forces of microevolution we looked at that creates adaptive change of this nature. Genetic drift is not thought to be capable of leading to such a change. We need to finally ask ourselves, what is a species? Because we've been using the word a lot. If you go through a biology lecture or a biology textbook, species is one of the most commonly used words in the biological lexicon. And yet, no one can agree on what a species is. There's some 20 definitions published of what a species is. I'm going to look at only 3 in the course of the next couple lectures. You have a general understanding of what a species is, and it tends to be a morphological concept. You go outside and you see a big black bird flying in the sky, and you say crow. And you see a little bird on the ground that's brown and nondescript, and you say sparrow. And you know they're different because they look different, and they fly differently. There's a tree of one type and a shrub of another type, and they're all different species. They're different natural kinds of thing. That's a traditional way of relating to these organisms, and safe enough, good for our basic interactions with the world. But as you dissect the definitions, you learn how complex it is. We'll also look at the biological species concept, which is one that if you ask a young biology student what is a species, they'll tend to recount a biological concept. So we'll look at that in some detail. And we'll move toward a phylogenetic species concept. Next week in lab, you're starting phylogenetic analysis. And you'll have 2 weeks of labs that focus on phylogenetics. And we'll need a new concept to help us in that context as a result of the inadequacies of these traditional concepts. A morphological concept, well, what are some of the problems with a morphological concept? You have a bunch of horses here running freely across the plains, these feral horses probably. They all kind of look different, right? Spotty, white with brown spots, beige, tan, big and dark, light and dark, large. Well, are these all different species? Of course not. It's just a horse. There's morphological variation among the individuals, but not sufficient by some criterion to establish them as different species on morphological grounds. They just vary in their patterning. There are many, many examples of this, and sometimes it has fooled biologists over time, especially in highly variable, widely geographically distributed organisms like snakes like these. These corn snakes look quite different over their distribution in the United States. It's more of a superficial difference, though. When you look more deeply, you can see the common underlying patterns that are overlain by the more showy, colorful patterns. It's all one species of snake by any of our concepts. This is one species of snake, and you can't naively apply a morphological concept to it. It has fooled biologists. Butterflies like these can respond to environmental cues and be influenced by the environment during their growth to look different as adults. It's not genetic variation here. It's just phenotypic plasticity in relation to environmental cues that lead to differences in the adult form. Yes? Do you have to look more along the terms of macroevolution to describe something like this, you're saying?
Yeah, what I'm saying is like
I'm sorry, I'm having trouble hearing you. It's, and we can discuss it more afterwards. I'm having trouble hearing it a little bit. But I think you're saying, wouldn't this constitute an evolutionary adaptation in itself? Well, it depends. This could just be driven by chemical cues that have no relationship to the environment in an adaptive context. There might be no adaptive explanation for these differences in color. Could simply be a byproduct of different chemistry in the environments and in their foods. So you'd have to dig into the system a little more to know whether to call this adaptive. But let's discuss it more. You have some good ideas there. Maybe this is a better example where you had adult butterflies that looked like this, of a couple different kinds, and they were considered a single species because they kind of looked all like this. But biologists had a suspicion based on behavioral differences that you were dealing with a couple different types. It wasn't until the larvae were studied and were found and studied in detail that it was seen how different the larvae were in terms of how they looked, spots versus stripes, and the microhabitat associations, the ecology that differed between the two larvae, that showed that the adults were monomorphic, but the larvae were quite different, signaling two different species that just happened to look alike as adults. So partly as a result of the problems with the morphological concept, when you get into the subtleties of these organisms, the biological species concept was advanced and became prominent. Ernst Mayr was a very famous biologist of the last century, one of the architects of the modern synthesis, an ornithologist, someone who studied birds, a German who worked in the old world tropics. And he articulated and defended with great success a biological species concept. And this is the one, as I said, you would probably be familiar with from basic biology. A definition, something like a species is a population whose members have the potential to interbreed in nature and produce viable, fertile offspring. So it's a reproductive concept. It concerns the ability to produce successful offspring. That's a species. If you can do that with another organism, then you are members of the same species. A reproductive criterion for your concept. The BSC, the biological species concept, constructed by an ornithologist, which is relevant because he's thinking about birds. For whom does this definition not work at all if you think about other biologists? What biologists might not appreciate this definition? Anyone want to try at that? Yes? If you're studying something that reproduces asexually, like bacteria that undergo binary fission, right? They just split to form their quote-unquote offspring. They're not reproducing sexually. So it just doesn't apply to those organisms. And that's a major gap if you're trying to present an integrated definition. So maybe we can't have a single species definition. Maybe we need multiple definitions to correspond to different organisms. What's another problem with a reproductive concept like this? Anything come to mind, probably from the plant section or elsewhere, that could inhibit a clean definition like this? Yeah. Some plants self-fertilize. That's really important, yes. Some plants hybridize. There's horizontal gene transfer. You guys looked at that a little bit? Horizontal gene transfer and the sharing of genes among organisms that represent different species by most other criteria. Those types of phenomena can confuse a clean biological species concept, and it may just require some modification. Quickly, along these isolating mechanisms that keep species apart, according to the BSC. This is pretty easy to understand. Just lots of quick examples I'll give you for prezygotic mechanisms and post-zygotic mechanisms leading to reproductive isolation. Because that's the key point. Organisms need to be reproductively isolated from each other, unable to share genes. It can happen before the zygote is formed, prezygotically, or after the zygote is formed, after fertilization, post-zygotically. So let's look at examples quickly of each of these. A few local examples. I always try to build in local examples to get you familiar with the Bay Area ecosystems and organisms in hopes that you'll go out and find some yourself, catch them. You can catch these snakes out here. We caught a couple of these on a field trip last week for another class I'm teaching. Aquatic garter snakes. These things live around the ponds around here and eat frogs, and they're beautiful little snakes, totally harmless. Go catch one. Well, they live near the water. We found ours near this little seep, little wetland, whereas the terrestrial garter snakes are just upland in the drier hill. So you can have these guys on the dry hillside, where these guys are down in the water. And they tend not to breed together because they're isolated by habitat. So they just don't breed together because they don't encounter one another. Can they breed together if you put them together? That's a different question. In fact, they're not breeding together as a result of a prezygotic isolating mechanism. Skunks like this, there's a beautiful little skunk that lives around here, this one. It's not your campus skunk with the long stripes that will scare you at night if you walk around campus and turn a corner and all of a sudden you see the aposematic flash of the black and white skunk. It will make you jump. It'll send a chill down your spine because you know intuitively that black and white there signals a danger, that you might get sprayed and have to live with a stench and you and your roommate for the next week. You know that intuitively because of the aposematic warning that the skunk delivers. Well, there's a little spotted skunk too. The stripes are broken into spots, and he's a little guy, and he can climb trees a little bit, and he hunts mice instead of being a omnivorous little forager in our trash cans. And it's a neat little skunk. It's called a western spotted skunk. Oh my gosh, your common names are backwards. Doesn't matter, but Spilogale putorius is our local western. Spilogale gracilis is the eastern. They don't breed together. Even though they're so similar, they breed at different times of the year. One breeds in the fall and one breeds in the spring. Their breeding seasons are very short. So when the males and females are ready to breed in the one species, they're not ready to breed in the other species. They can't breed together because they're temporally isolated from each other. These examples are fun, and I could talk a lot about them, but I need to get through them. Behavioral isolation, birds like these are blue-footed boobies. They go through an elaborate dance like this, such that if you're another booby and your dance is just not going to look right to the other bird, and thus you're not going to reach the point where you form a zygote because you have to go through this elaborate courtship ritual to get to that point. And so if the dance isn't just right, it's not going to work. So you have a behavioral mechanism for isolating this species from other species. You've got to step just so in order to be successful. These blue-footed boobies are famous from the Galapagos, but a couple of them made it all the way up here to the San Francisco area last year. I don't know if they're here again this year, but they sometimes come this far north, especially in a warming world. You might get them in the Faroe Islands more consistently. It's a very familiar sound. Hear that? It's a familiar sound in North America. It's a meadowlark calling. And here's another meadowlark. See if you can tell the difference. Hear how different that is? You can hear the difference. Better believe they can hear the difference. They sing differently, and they're not going to mate together because they don't sound right to one another. So they're behaviorally isolated from each other just by the way they sing. Organisms can be mechanically isolated from one another, physically isolated from one another because of something about their morphology. Snails like these are either right-handed or left-handed, dextral or sinistral. They coil one way or the other way. And if they coil opposite ways, they have trouble mating together because of the way their reproductive organs are set up. They're hermaphroditic, so they have male and female parts in each snail. But if they don't coil the same way, they can't mate properly. So that's simple as that. There's more of a story there, but I'll skip it. Snakes come into play in an interesting way. You can read about it if you Google it. The gametes might be incompatible. So say that the gametes are actually able to contact each other, unlike the snails where they're misaligned so the gametes never even encounter one another. What about sea urchins that deliver their gametes into the water column and circulate among each other? Well, the gametes might not recognize each other if they even bump into each other physically. The protein coats might not be such that they're compatible. So they can be separate at the level of the gamete itself, gametic isolation. And now we've gotten to a point where, okay, those are all pre-zygotic. What happens if the zygote is able to form? What happens from there to help reduce the likelihood of species interbreeding in the biological species context? The Encetina salamanders are an example. Some of them do form hybrids, but the hybrids tend not to be viable. They tend to be smaller and not survive, not forage properly, not survive with likelihood. So they have reduced hybrid viability. Even though they form the hybrids, the zygotes form and develop into small adults, they're not viable. Sometimes the hybrid is very much viable, like the mule. This is a great local barnyard example. I love this case. Because mules are these amazingly strong type of horse that forms from the breeding of a horse with a donkey. A horse and an ass makes a mule. But the horse and the ass have a chromosomal difference that leads to the infertility of the mule. So the mule is infertile, big and strong, and a great work animal on a farm, bigger and stronger than a donkey, and more just nicer. And stronger than a horse, stouter than a horse, and more powerful than a horse. Mules are highly desirable for work, but they're infertile. And you can't breed a mule with a mule and get another mule. You have to keep your darn horse and your donkey and breed them again to get your next mule. That's hilarious to me for some reason. Hybrid breakdown, just a case where the hybrids form. Maybe the next generation is strong and successful, but over time, over the generations, the hybrids become unsuccessful. Just an extension of those examples, not critical. All right, once again, Encetina. And I'll be finishing up with this example probably. Encetina, I've just described, our local one. Encetina escholzii xanthoptica is the one that's a newt mimic here locally. Look at its range. Escholzii in green. Wait a second. No, xanthoptica in purple. It's just that limited range in the Bay Area and just to the south, like I described, down towards Santa Cruz County and so forth, with maybe a population out here in the Sierras. Jumping the valley. No Encetina in the valley. It's too dry. These salamanders need moisture. There's a bunch of different named kinds that ring the Valley of California. Hypothetically, they came from the north in a previous era. They came from the north as illustrated in this little video that proceeds slowly as the creature is hypothesized to move down from the north over the millions of years from Oregon into California and diverging along the way into these forms that are blotchy in the Sierra side, more uniformly patterned on the coastal side, but differing in coloration, each from the next. So they've changed in their morphology as they've moved from north to south to take on these different forms. They can breed together. So this one can breed with its neighbors successfully. There may be some reduced hybrid viability, but they can successfully breed and are thus the same species by the biological species concept criterion. But down here in the southernmost part of the range, this form here, Escholzii and Clauberi, when they've encountered each other, having moved down separately on either side of the valley, they can't breed together. They can't breed together at all and are thus considered different species by the BSC. So this was set up as a challenge to some degree to the BSC. Ernst Mayr himself said this is a great example of microevolution, changing in populations in their genetic structure and morphology over time into these small changes that lead to a speciation event down here. Think about it, though. If this one can breed with this one, which can breed with this one, and this one, and this one, and this one, and this one. So your Clauberi here can breed with all its neighbors, which themselves can breed with one another. It should be the same species as this one. But in fact, we know it's not. So conceptually, there's just a violation of the biological species concept. If you work your way around the ring, These two should be able to breed with each other, but they just can't. So you have a fundamental, it's like a philosophical invalidation of a formal biological species concept. If you really want to challenge it, that's an interesting way to do so. So the whole question of speciation, and the title of this lecture today, was the one that exercised Darwin, right? Speciation, these lineage-splitting events, and the creation of these new species. How does that happen? How does that work? We'll call it cladogenesis when we start to get into phylogenetic systematics. We won't worry so much about species. We'll worry about clades. We'll worry about new kinds of organisms that form units in a phylogenetic analysis. That'll become an important way that we think about these organisms, rather than in a traditional species context. I have 2 minutes just to illustrate this point, and I'll let you go for the weekend. Islands were certainly important to Darwin, in the Galapagos and elsewhere. And what he saw was that organisms can get to islands and change form. Here's a red lizard getting to this island and going green. Illustrated like this. A, from the mainland, gets to the island where it finds it to its liking because there's no other organisms there and lots of resources in step one. And this is his model really from the Galapagos, as illustrated later. Well, A may evolve into B as a result of microevolutionary forces, founder effects, genetic drifts acting on this population, adaptation to local environment. All of these things can lead to a new population with different genetics from your mainland population. It's B. And then B hops to the next island. So now you have, at this point in time, a different species living on these two islands. Well, B may evolve into C, which then island hops. And C evolves into D, and so forth. So you get this overlaying of patterning that can lead to the complexity of something like the Galapagos through speciation as a result of the forces that we've outlined. Any quick questions before I let you go have a great weekend? Let's talk about it afterwards. We've got so much to talk about. Any other quick ones? Do you have time to come on up and we can chat? I hope so. Thanks, you guys.